I'm Mel.
And we're here with the Grow Where You're Planted, episode 2, Weeds and Seeds.
Let's talk about it. Let's get into it.
I just want to talk about something else first. I want to talk about the title of this episode. Is it just because the word seeds and weeds rhyme? Is that why we're putting these together?
No, I thought it was appropriate because in the springtime, that's pretty much what I'm doing. I don't know about you, Holly, but I'm pulling weeds, prepping garden areas, and I'm planting seeds. That's what I've been up to.
Yeah, it is. That's the time of year it is. It's first week of May. It's been raining a little bit. And today we're going to offer you some insights about working in your garden, specifically at this time of year, generally speaking, in different size spaces, small spaces to a little bit larger. Mel, let's talk about weeds first. Get those over with. Why do they even show up? Let's even talk about what a weed is. What's a weed? What's your definition of a weed?
I define a weed as anything that's growing where you don't want it to grow, right? You could have a volunteer vegetable that you don't want to grow in the place that it's growing, and it could be considered a weed. So anything that you don't want growing there. Now, I tend to pull probably a lot more weeds than Holly does. Holly, I've known you to dig up weeds with pretty flowers on them and put them in pots. So I think everybody defines weeds differently as far as what they don't like in their garden. Yeah.
It is. It's a plant that's growing that you don't want to be growing there. So if there's a gorgeous hydrangea, bite my tongue, that's growing somewhere that you don't want it, I guess you could consider it a weed. So what do we do? I mean, I guess when we're gardening, we're always thinking ahead. Like gardeners, we're always playing the long game. I mean, the stuff we do takes months to come to fruition. So I guess a lot of what we do with weeds is we're trying to prevent stuff. We're trying to prevent the weeds from coming in. So how do we do that? There's mulch. You talk about lasagna gardening. Talk a little more about that.
Like you're saying, plan ahead and cover it up. Covering up weeds has been what I found to be like the least labor-intensive way of controlling weeds, right? You've got a whole bunch of grass growing in a garden path. The best thing, as far as I'm concerned, or the easiest thing I can do is try to cover that up. So for a garden path, say, I might do just cover it with plastic, either clear or black plastic. Actually, I was doing some prep for this show today, and I was reading that clear plastic is actually better than black plastic for killing weeds. It's called solarizing. Now, I didn't ever know what it was called, and we just happen to have lots of black plastic laying around the farm. It's easy to get, so that's what I use, and it seems to work pretty well. But you could use clear plastic. Holly, have you ever experimented with that at all?
Not with clear plastic, and my experience with plastic in general has usually been because it's around.
Right.
Like I know that covering it up and hiding the sun and, all that stuff is going to get rid of a plant. So the other thing I use are tarps. I use a lot of tarps. Again, because we have them. So I'm super curious about that clear plastic thing because it's the opposite of what it's against my, it's against my intuition. I wouldn't think that letting the sun in is gonna, let's kill those weeds.
Right. So, I think there's a balance between, like creating a greenhouse effect where you've got airflow and you're controlling the temperature so it doesn't get too hot. But, if you've got clear plastic low to the ground like that, I can imagine it's going to get so hot under there, it's just going to cook anything that's growing. The only thing I am cautious of when I'm doing that technique, particularly if I'm doing it in an area where I do want to grow something, is that when you're heating the soil to high temperatures like that, either using the black plastic or the clear plastic, you're also killing the microbiology in the soil, which is really important for promoting plant growth and plant health. So just being cautious that perhaps if you do that after the fact, wanting to add in something like compost that's full of that microbiology.
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, I almost think if you can, I guess thinking now that you're saying that, if you can keep the temperature cool enough but still warm, maybe you even get a composting factor happening.
Sure.
Sometimes.
Yeah. And so there are other methods you can use in areas where you want to grow something. So that's why I say the black plastic is great if you just want to nuke it, or the clear plastic. If you just want to kill everything, including the seeds, go for it. Because I do understand there are areas of the garden that are just frustrating.
But
you can never get rid of the weeds.
But if you're getting rid of weeds because you want to make that area a garden bed later, then maybe you want to take a little more care in being aware of the microbiology of the soil when deciding on your path of weed eradication and prevention. So the lasagna...
Which actually leads us really well, into the lasagna garden. We were just about to say it at the same time. Jinx, you owe me a Coke.
Now I can't talk the rest of this episode. Wait, let me go get you a soda. So lasagna that would be like... And what I'm thinking from remembering talking to you about it is like a layer of cardboard and maybe a layer of wood chips or some, or the cardboard, and then some manure or other sort of high nitrogen thing. And then on the top of that,
Right. So the idea with lasagna gardening is that you're layering carbon heavy material like straw or cardboard or newspaper with like you're saying, nitrogen-rich material like manure. Even green manure is okay because you're going to let it sit for a long time. And then also I throw in compost, whatever I got around the yard. Your grass clippings are great for adding nitrogen in there. So really you're just building a layered stack of carbon and nitrogen. And there are other amendments you can add into there to help it to move the process along more quickly, because what you're basically building a compost pile, and depending on what you add to it, it's going to break down more quickly or more slowly depending on what you've added. And that's, there's lots of articles online about how to do that properly, but really, even just cutting down, weed whacking an area and throwing cardboard on top of it, that's going to decompose and it'll become a nice patch of dirt that you can till up and garden in.
So
actually, I want to correct myself there.
Okay.
In lasagna gardening, you're not going to be tilling it. When you're doing a true lasagna garden, you're just going to let it decompose and plant right in it. If you're just trying to kill a patch somewhere in the dirt, likely if it's covered in grass and you kill the grass, under that is going to be really compact soil. So you're going to have to do some loosening of that soil and tilling. But keep in mind that that's also going to bring up new weed seeds. And so it might have to be a phased approach if you're really trying to kill a high density weed area.
So here's an example from my life just recently. After hearing about your experience last summer with doing a cardboard covered that bed in the front of your house, your nice decorative zone there, I used that same cardboard trick to make a nice long narrow bed for sunflowers. And I think that what I did, I could have left the cardboard for a lot longer. and it would have decomposed even more, and there would have been less for me to have to sort of tear up to get into the soil. But it wasn't really that long of a time. And what I did is I had the cardboard over, and then I put a tarp over on the top of that. And after, 3 months, maybe 4 months, I went in there and I put my sunflowers in. My little sunflower starts are in there right now, and they're loving it. So I did notice that some little weeds were starting to pop up. So I just went in and mulched it. It's really easy to mulch it when it's just your plants in there and like 2 little weeds sprouting around, because you can just get that mulch everywhere. So I mulched with some straw. And now it's a great bed. It looks like it's been there for a long time. And it just took that cardboard and a little bit of time. And it was free. You know, cardboard just comes in the mail free. And the tarps I had lying around the garden.
Yeah, and that straw is where are you getting that from?
For the chickens, but I didn't want to use hot straw on a freshly planted starts. So instead of using some fresh chicken straw with a bunch of chicken poop on it, I just used brand new clean straw. But the straw is great because it doesn't have any seeds in it either.
The last thing I want to talk about with regards to weed prevention is plant crowding. This is a method where you're going to plant your plants close enough so that when they're mature, their leaves are going to be just touching their neighbor. So what that does is it covers up the ground surface and provides a good competition against weeds.
Well, yeah, and you're going to block out the sunlight to the soil, which stops those weeds from getting the light they need to flourish.
Right, which stops those seeds from germinating.
I do have a question about that. You know, there's recommended spacings of plants. I don't always pay attention to that. Are you kind of agreeing with that idea of maybe the recommended spacing is just a recommendation, is just that?
Yeah, I do. I tend to push it with regard to crowding in my garden beds, not only because it helps to beat out any weeds that would want to grow there, but also because I can get more product out of my space. So yeah, I do. I tend to plant things a little closer together. The only important thing with that is just making sure that you have a really rich soil so those plants aren't competing for nutrients.
Well, let's talk about some tools that we use when it comes to getting rid of those little suckers. Once you have weeds, you got to get rid of them. I feel like that's why hoes were invented, is to sort of get rid of weeds, just scrape the top of the soil and get rid of those suckers.
Yeah, garden hose are great tools for the garden. They're great for scraping weeds out of the soil, but also they're good for if you need to mound up a row, if you're building a row crop or you're trying to break up big clumps of clay soil. They're great for lots of things, so that's definitely a must-have tool.
Who knew that like a flat metal plate could become a multi-tool, right? Another great tool in the garden is Grandpa's weed puller. It's like engineering meets gardening with that leverage action. Have you used those Grandpa's weed pullers?
I have. Yeah, I really like them for managing weeds in a lawn. I find they're handy. I don't use them in my garden beds at all, but the Grandpa's weed puller, it helps you to pull out weeds without having to bend over. To go ahead and pull it out. It's on a big long stick, and like Holly said, it's a little forked pinch that just yanks things that have long tap roots like your dandelions right out of the ground. And so that's a great tool, especially for our older folks or folks who have mobility challenges. It's a real handy device.
My mom was visiting once. My parents were visiting, and my mom was helping me. We were just actually standing in the front of the house in the garden, and then there's dandelions and everything. And when I've got the grandpa's weed puller out and she's using it, let me find some more. Like, it's really satisfying. It's a super fun tool. Let me find some more of those weeds. Give me that. There's some more over here. It's
I find that now that I have more space, more lawn space, grass. I don't know that I would call my space a lawn. It's just grass that we fight back constantly. I don't use the grandpa's weed puller as much, but I did find it really helpful when we lived in town and wanted to try to keep a nice yard. And so I imagine you're using yours more than I do, Holly.
A little bit. I think my goal is to sort of have less grass in the front yard. So as less grass is there, it's needed less. But it's it's on smaller plots of lawn. It's really handy to just get rid of those little dandelions, especially that pop up.
I do want to add though that those dandelions in your yard, if you can stand them and they don't drive you too nuts, they are good for the bees. If you're going to pull flowers from the yard, from the lawn, you might want to plant some ornamentals for the bees to replace that. Like Holly's got a front yard full of ornamentals that the bees are just visiting all the time and loving. So just keeping that in mind as you're going to eradicate weeds. What could I leave for the bees?
Mm-hmm. Another one of my favorite tools in the garden, and really I could do almost anything when it comes to sort of a medium or larger landscaping project, is this McLeod tool, which is like a really heavy-duty hoe that's much wider on one side, and the other side has forked prongs, like four really solid prongs, and it's great for digging up clumps and it's clayey soil like we have a lot around here, as well as sort of pushing dirt around. But it gets roots up. You can pull the roots really well with those forks, those prongs. It's a great tool, the McLeod.
Yeah, I really like the McLeod when I'm trying to move around wood chips too. I find that to be really handy. You can use rakes and things, but really the McLeod is a great tool for that.
I think there are the handheld versions sort of have the same pair of tools, the flat hoe like on one side and the forked prongs on the other side. A nice handheld version is probably really, really handy also.
Yeah, that's great for the garden beds. I use it all the time, and pulling up weeds too. Just when you really have to just get down on your hands and knees and pull weeds that way, the handheld two-sided cultivator is a really handy tool to have.
Will you really quickly talk about sort of an herbicide blend, those organic herbicide mixes?
Yeah, so one way that I eradicate weeds in my garden is by using non-toxic herbicides, organic herbicides essentially. And there's a few mixes. I've always used a mix of vinegar, salt, and dish soap. That's really great. Its intent is to dry out the plant, right? All the cells in the plant shrivel up and it can't live anymore. And another sort of recipe that I saw online when I was preparing for this talk this morning was a mix of water, vodka, or rubbing alcohol, and dish soap.
That almost sounds like a cocktail, but
I wouldn't recommend drinking it, but yeah, it's really the only use for vodka in my house, as far as I'm concerned. Much prefer gin myself, but that's just...
Yeah.
That's beside the point. The other weed prevention trick that I read about, there's a few. I've used boiling water before. If you don't want to mix anything or mess with any of that, I totally get it. Just boil some water and pour it on the plant. It might take a few applications, but again, you're just, all that steam that's going to come off of that plant after you pour the boiling water is going to dry it out, and it's not going to be able to continue to live. But I really think is interesting is using corn gluten meal. Apparently, this is a great product for preventing seed germination. So, say you're going to use it in your garden bed. What you do is you would weed out your garden bed, plant your plants, let them start growing, and then once your vegetable plants that you want to grow are growing, you can sprinkle this corn gluten meal around, and it'll prevent other seeds from germinating in that garden bed, which I think is great. I didn't, like I said, I haven't done a ton of research and I haven't tried it myself, so do your own research, do your own tests in your garden. I don't know how long after applying it in your garden it will prevent seed germination, but hey, it's an interesting thing, and I'm always experimenting. I don't know about you, Holly, but
I just wait for your experiment.
Well, I'll try it and I'll let y'all know.
So there's one really cool thing I want to talk about before we move out of the weeds section and into the seeds, and that is
our favorite weed eating tool,
the Weed Dragon.
Oh yeah.
And we are going to put this little YouTube link in the show notes so you can see it in action. But it's basically a propane torch that's heating up your weeds so they can't be alive anymore. The Weed Dragon is basically a propane torch.
On a stick.
On a stick, right? It has a hose so you can aim your flame, the dragon, at whatever you need to. We've used it over here in our raised bed garden when we took out all the grass and lawn around the raised beds. We wanted to put wood chips, so we weed whacked. Then we used the Weed Dragon, especially right up against the garden beds, the raised beds. And then we put a weed mat over the top of that and wood chips over the top of that. And after a couple years, it looks okay. I have to go in and weed a little bit, but not right around. A lot of the beds really stayed pretty weed free.
Yeah, we definitely are using the Weed Dragon over here for large areas like that, or I guess your garden paths aren't too large, but for, big patches of things. I use it a lot in our driveway. We have a gravel driveway that the grass likes to grow through, so I go and hit it really hard with the Weed Dragon. I have seen it in the commercials and in the videos where they're using it as a spot weeder, right? Just on the one dandelion in the grass, hitting it. But I tend to use it like you, Holly, for larger patches of really grass, mostly. I'm sure it would be great for blackberries and other things. I've seen people using it along their fence lines so that, instead of a weed whacker, you can burn up your fence line. What I do want to say just because we live in California, this is fire country. If you are going to use a Weed Dragon, it is fire. Use it when the grass is a little bit damp, or when, not in the middle of July when it's hot and everything is dry. There is a fire risk when using that tool. So look up the safety guidelines, follow them, use the tool. It's great.
And as a good buddy of mine says, 1, 2, 3, safety first.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about seeds, Mel. But let's first talk about how we even decide what we can plant in our yards. I mean, I think some things are kind of universally grown. Like lettuce is something that a lot of people can grow. Carrots, a lot of people can grow. But how do you know? How do you know what you can grow?
It's really important to know what planting zone you're in. A planting zone is a designation given by the United States Department of Agriculture. Here in Humboldt County, we have a few planting zones because we are a large county with a lot of different elevations and distances from the coastline. So On the coast here, we're in a 9B agricultural zone, and inland a little bit further up in the mountains, you've got 9A and 8B planting zones. Now, those are important to know about because what that's going to tell you is the first and last dates of frost in your area. So, you don't want to be starting seeds right when you're going to get outside, when you're going to get a hard frost coming through, because that's going to kill your tender baby plants. So that's really important to know. It's also important to know for your perennial plants how cold your winters are in your area on average, because those perennials aren't going to be able to survive in zones where it gets either too cold or too hot even in the summer months. For annual plants like most vegetables and some flowers, we need to pay attention to things like length of the growing season and again the typical dates of your first and last frosts. So that's why your ag zones are really important to know and where you're at. That being said, though, here in Humboldt County, we have this unique microclimate zones. So for example, when you're right on the coast, you're going to be able to grow things differently than someone who's in a protected valley that's a little bit farther from the coast, right? Away from that fog belt.
So I want to veer over to a little sciencey stuff now. We talk about these plant zones and length of growing season. So, tropical plants have those giant leaves. And the more north you get, I feel like the leaves get smaller and smaller, like it's a growing season thing almost. Like, oh, sure, I have all this time to grow this giant leaf. Or, oh, I better get my little leaves grown because winter's coming. I mean, I wonder if there's any correlation there between that. Just a little thought that I had as we were talking about garden zones.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of factors that go into, certainly the size of a plant and the growing season is one of those factors, certainly. But also access to water and nutrient content of the soil and those things as well.
So, when we're picking seeds, we need to check the seed package out, or we need to know the information about the seeds. And like our zone, do we see that zone information on the seed package?
I've got 3 seed packets in front of me, and not one of them mentions ag zone. So I'm going to safely say no.
And, that has always kind of... I'm going to go with the strong language. I've been annoyed, Mel. Why don't they put the ag zone on the seed package? Anyway.
I don't know. But one indication you can look at is to see the soil temperature for germination, which is going to be on the back of every seed packet. And that's going to tell you, like, for example, right now I'm looking at a seed packet that's for tomatoes, and it's got a soil temp for germination between 70 and 90 degrees. Now, I know from experience in Humboldt County that we don't get those kinds of soil temperatures until later in the season. And so I'm going to do something to mitigate that, right? I might start my tomatoes in a greenhouse where the soil temperature will be warmer. And I've experimented with that by just using a thermometer and testing my soil temperatures at different times of year. And then the other thing you can do for that is also using a heat mat. So even if you can't, if something requires a really high temperature for seed germination, you can take measures to mimic that.
Like putting your germinating seeds on top of your refrigerator where it's nice and warm. There you go.
Right. That's a great tip or trick. So picking the right plants for your area, I would say go to your local garden center. Anything that they have there that is a start is going to be something that you probably can grow where you are. Perhaps they might have, like at our garden center here, they do sell citrus plants, which are great. But we also know that if you're going to grow a citrus here in Humboldt County, you need a microclimate to create that. So a protected space.
So you're saying I should go to the garden store and just do reconnaissance and not buy stuff?
Well, you can buy seeds. You can see what kind of starts they have and then buy the seeds for those things. Or just the other place you can might see starts is at farmers market. I see our local farmers are selling seed starts. And so in the early spring, those starts here in Humboldt are leafy green things, and your brassicas, your broccoli, your cabbage, your chard, or cauliflower.
Yeah.
So those are the things you're going to see early in the season. A little bit later, maybe starting about now, about May, you might start seeing tomatoes and peppers.
Oh my.
But again, keeping in mind that knowing what your plant hardiness zone is and knowing your garden space, that if you are going to buy a tomato or something that requires a little more heat, you're doing it in a greenhouse or in a zone that's protected. One tool I find really helpful for figuring out what plants I'm gonna put in the garden and when to plant them is a book that someone gave me right when I first started really gardening in Humboldt County, and it's called The Humboldt Kitchen Gardener, a concise guide to raising organic vegetables and fruits in the greater Humboldt County region. This book is great because it breaks Humboldt County into two different regions, the coastal zone and then the interior zone or the inland zone. Which, as I explained before, in Humboldt County, we have different plant hardiness zones. So it's important to know where you are in the county and how close to the coast you are, because you have to account for that coastal influence of fog and cooler temperatures.
Don't we call those microclimates?
Well, as well as the hardiness zones, there are microclimates in Humboldt. And so, for example, when we're talking about microclimates, in the city of Arcata, which is very close to the coastline, you wouldn't dream of planting tomatoes outside where the fog could come in. We have a lot of problems with blight, and so tomatoes would not do well here on the coast outside of a greenhouse. But if you just go a few miles inland to, say, the city of Blue Lake, they can grow tomatoes outside no problem because they're in a valley, they're a little more protected, and they don't get quite as much fog as we get here on the coast. So those microclimates are really important to pay attention to. You're also making a microclimate when you say build a greenhouse or put in a row crop cover, which we're going to talk about in a minute.
So is Blue Lake still considered the same hardiness zone as the coastal part of Arcata, say?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's a Humboldt Kitchen Gardener. It's a great book. It talks about a lot of the stuff we're talking about here today, as far as amending your soil and weed management, planting times, ag zones, all those different things. So I highly recommend it. We'll put a link in the show notes. Go check it out.
Excellent. We've got our seeds and we're going to need to sow them. So where do you sow them? You can sow them in containers, which means you'll need a growing medium. I always like using something I have around the house. I hate buying soil, or dirt. I hate buying dirt. Why should I buy dirt? My backyard's full of dirt. I don't need to pay for it. But I don't mind, say, spending some money on some amendments that I might need, that I feel like that my soil's lacking. I'll use some compost dirt as soil. I often will add perlite and vermiculite to lighten it up. If it's an emergency, I will buy soil at the store and buy some bagged dirt. And then in that case, I don't worry too much about amending because I figure it's nice, fresh dirt that my plants will enjoy and like. So in a pinch, sure, I'll get some dirt from the store, but I definitely would rather make my own growing medium. I know you use some other stuff. What else do you
I think
use?
so when you're talking about dirt from the store, I think you're talking about, bagged potting soil or perhaps bagged gardening soil, which, like you say, in a pinch, if you don't have the space or the time to make it yourself, those work great. Some of the bagged organic potting soils that I've used or garden soils that I've used have kind of larger chunks of wood in them, like some bark kind of stuff. And so I'll go through and I'll sift those out when I'm starting seeds because they can act as a barrier and a hindrance to your seed germination. And basically you don't want it to block the seed from coming up out of the soil. So often I will sift store-bought garden soil if that's what I'm using. And then I'll mix that with some compost and some perlite or some cocoa coir, and I think that makes a really nice mix. If you want to sift your garden soil and you're only doing a small amount, I have a heating grate that I like to use that has little 1/4-inch holes in it that works just perfectly. If you're doing a larger amount, there are stand-up sifters that you can purchase or make yourself using 2x4s and hardware cloth. And I use those for my compost pile because that also has wood bits in it that I don't necessarily want.
Oh yeah, a ton of sticks and stuff.
Yeah, just get
there's
that
all kinds of stuff in there. So then we put them in the containers. I know that I have purchased starts in the past. So I have all these used 6-packs and I have all these used 4-inch pots or used gallon pots. So I definitely can use those to sow in the containers. I like also making the biodegradable ones with newspaper. You just wrap newspaper around a jar or other sort of cylinder and wrap the bottom up so that you have this, little pot of newspaper. I use like a paper tape, like masking tape, to close that up. And then I actually am not worried about sewing in pots for those sensitive plants because I can just pop that paper compostable pot right into the ground without disturbing that plant or its roots, which I think is a nice transition into direct sowing, unless you have other ways that you sow in pots.
Just two things. I mean, when I was living in apartments and trying to grow things on the porch or, in a windowsill, I would just use whatever kind of plastic tub I had around. Sour cream containers work great, yogurt containers, and just making sure that you're allowing drainage for those plants. So whatever you have around. The other thing I tried last year, which I thought was kind of fun, was the soil blocks. So you can create your seed mix, use a tool to compact it into a little circle or a square. They have, ones that are manufactured for purchase at different garden stores, but I made mine out of just a large dowel and just some aluminum wrapped around there. So soil blocks, look them up if you want to use them. They're kind of fun. There's some challenges to them, but yeah, again, it goes along the same lines as the biodegradable pots. And I like the homemade biodegradable pots. There are, of course, store-bought ones, but homemade is always so much cheaper. And then I really like the soil blocks idea because then you don't even have that paper barrier. There's nothing to make or to do. You have to make the soil blocks, but it's interesting. I'm still experimenting with it, so.
Yeah, you just drop and go.
Yeah, one of the challenges I could highlight with the soil blockers is watering. You really want to be using a misting system or something when you're watering them, because if you get them too wet, the blocks fall apart and you've got a big old mess on your hands. So.
Yeah, I would think that would be the one issue. But otherwise, I've seen them and they're really cool. They're super nifty. Nifty.
Yeah, so let's talk about, Holly, you kind of alluded to it earlier. Let's talk about why you might want to use a biodegradable pot or a soil block to start your seeds. What do you use them for?
So I use them for plants that, at least I've heard, are sensitive to transplanting, like corn or squash or cucumbers. Although I have done all of those in pots that I had to transplant later, and for the most part they were just fine. But to be extra safe and extra nice to the plants, definitely using those for those sensitive plants is really, really
they
nice.
definitely say, you know, some plants like squash, corn even, they're sensitive to transplanting, right? So part of that is root disturbance when you're transplanting them. So making sure that you have a start that is not, if it is one of these sensitive, and just as a general rule of thumb, you don't want your start to be root bound when you're planting it in the ground, making sure that it hasn't gone too far, because that can stunt growth. Another reason that you might have problems transplanting a specific kind of plant is because it's sensitive to changes in the nutrient content of its soil. So, you know, you've got your little start and it's surrounded with its packet of soil, but then you're going to go put it in some other soil that has a different balance of nutrients. And so that may affect how the plant grows from that point on. So just being really cautious of that, like Holly was talking about, and aware of it, but you can still play around with it. I still will transplant things or start things in biodegradable pots that don't like to be transplanted. Like I've had plenty of success with cucumbers, with winter squash, with summer squash. And also, Holly, I think you've had some success with corn, right?
Corn, yes, I have. As you were talking about the nutrient balance in the soil, and I just had this picture of little baby seedlings trying to make it in the world, and they don't want to get soil shock.
Right, they're little babies, they're sensitive, so you put all this time and effort right from the beginning when you're gardening, right from when you're preparing the soil. So there are some reasons you might try to do some transplanting of things that may or may not like it, but that's okay. Do it. Try it. You can extend your growing season by doing that. You know, if you have your tomatoes I do it for cucumbers. I can start them a lot earlier if I'm starting them in the greenhouse or the winter squashes than if I were starting them outside. So I do like to do that, but in the biodegradable pots. And again, if you don't have pots, the plastic pots are just fine. Just watch out for them getting too big before you move them over into the soil.
And there are some things that I just would never start in pots. Like I wouldn't do carrots in pots. I know that you don't do beans in pots. I don't do beans in pots.
Yeah, if I'm trying to sow a large area, I'm going to choose to direct sow. For example, if I'm doing a huge long row, a 30-foot row of dry beans, I'm not going to start 300 beans or whatever it would be individually in 6-packs and then go and hand plant those starts. That's just too much work for me. So I'm going to dig out my 30-foot trench, and then I'm going to plant my beans, cover it up, mulch it, and let it go for the year, get my irrigation in or whatever. But I'm not going to spend the time to start things in pots first, especially for the beans. I also row crop corn, so I don't tend to start that early in the greenhouse. I find that I have a short season sweet corn that I like to grow, and I find it does just fine if I start it outdoors, again in a row kind of situation. One thing I did want to mention briefly about starting beans or peas or even peanuts, any legume, you want to use an inoculant in your soil, which is just a bacteria that's going to multiply once it gets into that soil, and it's going to promote nitrogen fixing, which beans and other legumes really need a lot of nitrogen to grow robustly.
Well, now it's time to talk about the 3 Ps. Prepping, promoting, and protecting when we are direct sowing into the soil. We've talked a little bit about what seeds we like to direct sow, but we want to make sure that the space is prepped for us. So I know that we need to prep by doing a few different things. I know you have some great things in your notes over there. So Mel, what are we doing when we prep our garden for that direct sow?
One of the first things I'm doing when I'm going to prep a garden space is either removing some kind of cover that I've put on it, like raking away a little bit of mulch right where I'm going to be planting something, or, pulling off, or even, sometimes you get lazy and you don't have a good mulch or a good weed cover or something in your garden. And so, I'm weeding. First step, I'm weeding. I'm getting anything that could be competitive with that plant out of there. But at the same time, I don't want to till up too much outside of the area that I'm going to be growing in, because that's, again, just going to promote more weed growth. So I'll weed the area that I want. I'll weed the entire garden patch, and then I will just till up right where I'm going to be growing something, right where I want to, I want to loosen the soil so those roots have plenty of options when they're spreading out. So that's really prepping. You're going to start amending with some amendments. I like compost is great. Chicken manure is great. Rabbit poop is fantastic for amending that soil. You can use it right away. You don't have to let it decompose at all first, or compost first. And
I love rabbit poop. It's one of my favorite things to amend with.
It really is. It's great. And then often I will, after amending with all of that, I'll go ahead and cover up with, maybe some straw or some other kind of cocoa coir is great as just a little mulch right where you've planted, just to keep those weeds down and keep it really moist. Especially if you're direct sowing seeds, it's nice to have a mulch there to keep that moisture in, because seeds are very small and can dry out really quickly. So particularly if going back to planting in trays or pots, and then as well as outdoors, you just want to make sure those seeds stay nice and moist. Otherwise, they're not going to germinate.
So what are a couple of the ways we're going to promote germination here?
I know you and I both like to use row crop covers occasionally, just to get that soil nice and warm. Like we talked about with the seed packets, on the back of your seed packet, it's going to tell you what temperature that your seed wants to germinate. Now, if your soil temperatures are only 60 degrees, you may not be able to get a tomato seed to germinate. So just making sure that you're using those crop covers, which is great for soil temperature. We already talked about using inoculant. That's less about promoting seed germination and more about promoting healthy, vigorous growth and the nitrogen fixing necessities of legumes. But in any case, it's doing those things that are going to help to promote your plant to be the healthiest plant it can be.
And we want to protect. So there's slugs, snails, moths, pests. I could gossip on and on with how much I hate pests in the garden, but how are we going to deal with that?
Snails everywhere. Yeah, snails everywhere. This year we have had a full-on snail fest. I swear, every time I pick up 2 snails together, they are making babies. It is just all over the place this year. They're really bad, and they're really destructive to the garden. Fortunately, my chickens love snails, so that's a great way to get rid of them. I don't let the chickens into the garden because they also love vegetables, but I definitely harvest snails and then toss them into the chicken coop and let them go nuts.
I use snail bait, but I have to make sure my pets are not getting into it, just because they like to eat it. And it's pet safe. That's not a problem. But if you have little rodents, guess what? They're also going to eat the snail.
The other things that the cabbage moths in particular are a real problem up in my garden, especially on those brassicas I keep talking about. And so one way which basically they're just a little white moth that you see flying around, and they lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves. And then when those eggs turn into caterpillars, the caterpillars can just completely decimate your plant. And it is really sad to have this beautiful, little start that you've started from seed or whatever, and then it just gets destroyed and is gone. So I really like to use those row crop covers again when I start seeing the white cabbage moths coming around. I'll just see them flying in the garden. I run out there and get my row crop cover on them so they can't go and lay eggs. The only thing you want to be concerned about with that is just your plants having enough water, because they can get pretty warm underneath a row crop cover, especially if you're not in, early spring or late summer when it starts cooling down, or fall, I mean.
I'm just now picturing you running out. I see those moths coming. Get up!
I shake my fist. The other huge garden pest, which I can't even believe we didn't write down in our notes, is gophers and moles to some extent.
Horrible.
Gophers are a big pain up here. I do everything I can to avoid having to deal with gophers. I have been making gopher pots and planting things, even in my row crop garden where I have like a big long 30-foot row. I'm making these troughs out of hardware cloth to try to protect my plants from gophers. But you know what? I had an artichoke in a gopher pot that I had made out of 1/4-inch hardware cloth, and the gopher came out of the ground and just ate the stem. So didn't even affect the plant below ground. It came up out of the ground, ate the stem, and it just toppled over, and I was really, really sad. So gophers, they're the worst.
And you know what else is the worst sometimes, at least? Technology.
Oh, man. Is it ever? But hey guys, we're garden people. We're not technology people. So please forgive us for any weird glitches or any strange noises. My dining room table is a little squeaky. So sorry about that.
Yeah, we're all figuring it out. So, but hey, you made it this far with us.
Yeah,
and that is awesome.
Thanks for listening. If you are, if anyone out there is listening, thank you.
But let's plug ourselves. What I've been plugging so far is my YouTube channel, Holly Esther. It has some of my backyard chicken videos posted and a couple of other silly things that I like. And you have a great Instagram.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, go check me out at Grossbury Farms, GROSSBURY. And I've got lots of fun photos on there. And coming up in the next few weeks, you might see a few photos of some baby goats. Our mama's about to have her baby, so we're really looking forward to that. In the meantime, there's cute pictures of baby rabbits. And some dogs and other things on there. So, and of course, vegetables.
Yay.
Go check it out.
So this was really fun, even though we had to deal with a bunch of technological hooey. But thank you, Mel. This is great.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. We'll talk to you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.